Hello everyone, welcome back to International Trade. Today we're gonna finish the Krugman model, the first part of the new trade theories, understanding what happens with trade. We're gonna study the effects of trade, assuming that there's another country which is identical to our economy, with which we start trading with costlessly. And there's no cost associated with exporting or importing goods, any extra cost. So this means that the other country has the same number of varieties produced that we have, and it also has the same number of workers. And so you can think of this as Denmark trading with Norway. Okay, in the Ricardian and Shirley model, such a trade could not happen because the two countries are identical. There's no need to trade with an identical country that has the same technology and the same amount of factors of production, like we're doing here. And the other countries' firms have the same technology than our firms, and we have the same number of workers. How can there be trade? We're going to see that. But before, we have to discuss how to actually model this, because this is pretty much equivalent to having an increase in the size of your home country. Okay, so Denmark start trades with Norway. If Denmark and Norway are identical in all possible ways, that trade is equivalent to having Denmark double its size. But so let's see how this works out. First, we want to show that indeed trade can be modeled as an increase in size. To see this, let us consider the firm problem. And recall that the profits of the firm, pi I, are equal to the revenues by IYI minus its variable costs, W beta YI, minus the fixed cost, alpha W. And with trade, this equals L plus L star C, that is the total output Y, because C is constant. I mean, C is the same across the two countries because consumers are identical, and since the countries are identical, consumers also earn the same income, and so their consumption of each variety will be the same. But now you have twice as many consumers as you did before. You have L plus L star consumers, and L equals L star. So this multiplies the price, PI, and then we have the variable cost, and the fixed cost. So here, let's first look at the first order condition, because this was giving us the first equilibrium condition of the model, the PP condition, the pricing equation. And so what we have is that L plus L star multiplies PI plus dPI dCi times Ci, and this equals W beta L plus L star. So the two L plus L star cancel out, and so no surprise that the fact that you trade with two countries does not affect the pricing equation, because we have the same FOC as we did in the autarky case. So the PP condition is identical to the autarky case, and let us recall that it was P over W equals beta, the marginal, the variable labor requirement, times the markup, which was eta Ci over eta C, no I, because those firms are identical, minus 1. Okay, what about the zero profit condition? Well, let's set profits to 0. So if profits are equal to 0, what we have is that we derived it last time. We had the P over W was equal to beta plus alpha over Y. So what does this mean? Well, in autarky, the zero profit condition was P over W equals beta plus alpha over LC. In trade, the zero profit condition becomes P over W equals beta plus alpha over L plus L star C. So what is the difference here? Well, we show that the PP condition does not change, and that makes sense. What about the zero profit condition? Well, the formula for the zero profit condition under autarky and trade is pretty much similar, right? The only difference is that in autarky you have L, and in trade you have L plus L star. But so what this actually means is that trade is simply increasing the size. Right? The effects of trade on the equilibrium are equivalent to an increase in size L. And so that's why we're going to model it that way. So to study the effects of trade, let me first rewrite the various equilibrium condition as well as the graph. And so the two equilibrium conditions, let's draw them on the plane that we discussed in the previous lecture. Also recall that the number of varieties in autarky, so let's say NA, was equal to 1 over alpha over L plus beta C. Excellent. So what we want to do now is study the effects of an increase in L. We want to study the effects on P over W, C. We care about total output Y. We care about the number of varieties produced in each country. So let's call that N and N star, right? Under trade. And the number of varieties available for consumption, NC, which is the summation of NT plus N star T. Okay? So an increase in L is going to affect the ZZ condition. In particular, is going to shift it downward. So we're going to have a new equilibrium where the price is lower and also the individual consumption of each variety is lower. Okay, so what do we have? Well, we have that, let me write it here again, P over W declines. Right? This is also often referred to as a pro-competitive effect of trade. Right? Because what is happening is that markups are falling. I mean, if the price falls and the marginal cost beta does not change, well, that means that the markups are falling. Why are the markups falling? Well, they're falling because the individual consumption C is declining, right? As a result, each consumers consume less of each variety. And what does that mean? Well, that means that each good becomes relatively more elastic, the demand becomes more elastic for each product, and therefore firms charge lower markups. Excellent. What is going on to total output? Well, we know in general that total output Y is basically LC. We know that L increases, we know that C declines, and so this sort of makes us wonder, well, what's happening to Y? Is the effect ambiguous? Well, let's look at the zero profit condition. So the zero profit condition tells us that P over W equals beta plus alpha over Y. So if P over W is declining, that means that the right-hand side is also declining, which means that output Y is increasing. So what is actually we can establish is that Y is increasing. Total output is increasing. Okay? So this actually makes a lot of sense. Why does it make a lot of sense? Well, because here is where you see the effects of increasing returns. So by the increasing returns to scale, the fact that you can, that your average cost decline with the total output, what is happening with trade is that firms are now available a larger market. Right? They not only sell to Denmark, they also sell to Sweden. As a result, so they can spread their cost over a larger set of unit of output, Y increases, despite each consumers consuming less of each variety. And because they're able to spread their fixed cost over a larger number of units of output, they can also reduce the prices. And so the fact that firms reduce the prices is thanks to the increasing returns to scale assumption. Okay? So now let's think a little bit about welfare. Is welfare improving? Well, each consumers consume less of each variety, so is that bad? Well, you know, the price over the wage is declining, which means that the wage over the price is increasing. So yeah, the welfare is improving, the real wage is higher. But the fact that consumers consume a little less of each variety suggests you that perhaps something is going to happen to the number of varieties. So first of all, let's look at the total number of varieties available for consumption and see. So let me write here again. This is number of varieties So to see how that varies, we can look, for instance, at the budget constraint. What is the budget constraint? Well, we know that our income, the wage, is going to be equal to the total consumption. What do we consume? Well, we consume a certain number of units C for each variety, which we pay at a price P, and we consume NC varieties. So that NC equals W over CP, which can also write as as 1 over C P over W. We know that C declines, P over W declines, and so the number of varieties available for consumption increases with trade. I mean, that makes sense, right? We established before that the consumption for each individual variety is declining. Well, that means that consumers are buying more varieties. We know that this is a good thing because consumers exhibit love for variety. So trade increases the number of varieties available for consumption. You know, not only you can buy Carlsberg, Tuborg, Mikkeller, you can also buy American IPAs, you can buy Heineken, you can buy all sorts of different beers from all over the world. And that is a positive thing. However, the question remains as to what happens to the number of varieties produced in each country. To see what happens to the number of varieties produced in each country, let's look at the full employment condition. We want to know what happens to NT and star T. So from the full employment condition, recall that the full employment condition was equating the total number of workers in a country, L, to the total labor demand. So all firms, say NT, were demanding beta Y workers for the variable production costs and alpha workers. Okay. Now, in this case, we're looking at the full employment condition for each country. So we cannot think that L is increasing. If you thought that L was increasing in the full employment condition, you're not finding the number of varieties in each country, you're finding the total number of varieties produced, summing together the varieties produced in each country. So in this case, L here remains constant. We know that Y increases, and so NT declines. So the number of varieties produced in each country declines. When Denmark starts trading with Sweden, some Danish company will exit. There will be fewer varieties produced in Denmark. Okay. However, recall that we established that NC, the number of varieties available for consumption, which equals NT plus N star T, is actually greater than the number of varieties in autarky. So this means that basically if Denmark first produced, say, 5 varieties in autarky, by trading with Sweden, say 1 variety exits, so now Denmark is only producing 4 varieties, but since you're trading with Sweden, Sweden also produces 4 varieties, and so the number of varieties available for consumption goes from 5 to 8. So you have 3 more varieties available for consumption. I guess it's also not surprising that the number of varieties produced in each country declines. You know, this relates back to the previous results. We established that prices decline, the consumption of each individual variety declines, but the total output increases. Okay? We saw that this relationship between the price and the output is driven by the increase in returns to scale. Since each firm produces more units of output, then the average cost declines, and so does the price. However, Since the number of workers in each country is the same, if you produce more output, you're basically assigning workers to more of the variable production costs, and you need to take some away from the fixed cost of production. So this means that some firm needs to exit for the total output in the economy to increase. Okay, so for that reason, the number of varieties produced in each country is going to decline. However, the number of varieties available for consumption increases. And this summarizes the effects of an increasing L of trade on the various variables that we mentioned. You know that the price declines, consumption of each individual variety declines, total output increases, the number of varieties produced in each country decreases, and the number of varieties available for consumption declines. So now let's summarize the main takeaways of this model. First, why do countries trade? We saw in the Ricardian model and in the actuarial model, countries traded so that they can, increase the utility of their consumers, right? And that was thanks to the fact that countries differed in terms of their technology or their factor endowments. In this case, there's no differences across countries. So you want to trade with the foreign economy because you want to consume the varieties of the foreign economy. Okay, Denmark wants to trade with the Netherlands so that it can import also some Heineken. Denmark not only exports cheeses to France, but also imports cheese from France. Why? Because both countries enjoy the different varieties of cheese. Now, there is an indeterminacy in the model of where the varieties are produced. The model cannot tell us whether Volkswagen is going to be produced in Germany or Italy, or whether Fiat is going to be invented and produced in Germany and Italy. That's something that the future work of Krugman deals with, but I guess that's okay. And we don't need to get to that level of detail. Okay, so now you may think that this is a little underwhelming, because you think, okay, countries produce different varieties. You've assumed that you like to have variety. That's why countries trade. It seems like this assumption is built, this result is built in the assumptions of the model. But a more compelling way to think about this is to think the following: why aren't all countries producing all of the varieties they need? Forget about property rights for a moment. If property rights didn't work, we wouldn't use them, right? They didn't serve a purpose. So the question is, why isn't Denmark producing all the toy varieties there are? Why isn't Denmark producing all the beer varieties there are in the world? Why are they only producing a subset of all of these varieties? Well, the answer is because of increasing returns to scale, and because of the fixed cost of production. Recall here there is a trade-off between producing more units of one variety and producing more varieties but fewer units for each one. Okay? And that trade-off is regulated by the fixed cost. Right? If you want to have more varieties, you need to put workers into the fixed cost, but that reduces the total output produced. So the key here is, why aren't all countries producing all of the varieties they wanted? Well, the answer is because of the fixed cost of production. If Denmark were to be producing all of the varieties in the world, pretty much all the workers in Denmark would be dedicated in the fixed costs of production. There would be, we would have great factories everywhere, but none of the factories would produce anything because there wouldn't be any workers for the variable production, okay? And so it's more efficient if countries sort of specialize in a subset of these varieties. More generally, what are the gains from trade? Well, here there is First of all, we have lower markups, and we call this a pro-competitive gain from trade. And because you can think of this as because of competition, but really it's because of the increase in returns. Since you can spread, when you trade, when Denmark starts trading with Norway, it doubles its customers. And so each Danish firm doubles its customer base. So it spreads its fixed cost over a larger number of customers, and as a result, can reduce the prices. And this was one of the main motivations that was used to convince the public of the NAFTA agreement. And so the idea that both Canadian car companies and American car companies would both benefit for the increased market size. Now, there are also more varieties available for consumption, and that is also a non-trivial component of the gains from trade. I'm going to show you just a little anecdote in a second. And finally, there is, hinted at least, there is an effect of sort of selection of firms. In other words, we saw in this model that when trade occurs, some firms in each country exit. We don't know which one in this particular model, but we're going to see in the follow-up to this new trade theory that we're going to start in the next video recording, that indeed what's going to happen is that the least productive firms will exit, and there will be an additional source of the gains from trade. So as I said, let's look at a little anecdote here for the number of varieties, because I realize that today we don't even think about this. When you go to any stores, you go buy running shoes or you go buy a phone or anything, you see in every store there's a ridiculous number of product variety. And, we don't realize how important that is, right? Oftentimes we have the opposite problem nowadays of sort of a paradox of choice. Too many varieties leads us unable to decide which one we would like to consume. But this was no longer the case, was not the case when Krugman was writing, especially 10 years before that. And the anecdote I want to mention is this book by Phil Knight. Phil Knight is the founder of Nike. And this is a book I have with me. And I think it's an interesting book. It has a lot of interesting anecdotes that you can drop, in conversations or in lectures. It's a story. I haven't finished it yet, but it's a great story of how this thing starts, and it shows you how to, the various issues that you might encounter when you create a new firm. You have issues of finance, back in the day in which venture capitalists were not as widespread as they are today. There were no accelerator at Aarhus University, right, for startups in 64. This is also a story of offshoring in a way, because the first Nike was produced in Mexico, and then production was moved to Japan before it started in the US. But so this whole thing starts with the Blue Ribbon company created by Phil Knight to import Tiger Onitsuka, which is a Japanese brand of running shoes, into the US. And this is because in his, I think it was MBA dissertation, Phil Knight was convinced that, the Japanese were being really good at producing electronic products. He also thought that they could be successful in the shoe industry. Why the shoe industry? Why he was a runner, he knew a lot about it and so on. But you can read the book for that. So how many varieties were there for running shoes in the 60s in the US? Well, according to Phil Knight, just two, really. It was Puma and Adidas. That was it. And these are the versions in 1968 where they, at the Mexican Olympics. Okay. So before 64, these were the two brands, the two firms in the market. Now, I'm sure there were also some smaller firms, but he doesn't mention them. Then after 64, when he starts importing Tiger Onitsuka, there's now 3 varieties of running shoes in the US. Now these shoes, I don't think I've ever seen them in Danish stores, but I mean they sell them in Italy, and they were used in the US back then for wrestling. And then in 71, Nike started. They started because they're pretty convinced that Onitsuka is going to drop them as their importer and supplier and distributor in the US. So they create this new brand, and now we have 4 varieties of shoes. And today, when you go to Sport 24 to buy running shoes, it's just a much larger number. So you see here what we're talking about. Here we have different types of shoes, and before 71, none of them is made in the US. Okay, so these are obviously gains from a number of varieties. Okay, so I hope you enjoyed this little anecdote. It's also a little break from the algebra. And now we can go back to the algebra and look at the Krugman 1980 model, which is by all means the same model that we saw before, but with one big difference in the preferences. So let's see. This Krugman 1980 model, which was actually even more successful than the previous paper, this is perhaps due to the tractability of this model. And what we have in this model is that instead of having a utility function, which is a summation from I equals 1 to n of v of ci, what we actually have is a functional form for vi, as the utility is the summation across all product varieties of ci to the power of sigma minus 1 over sigma. Ci is the individual consumption of variety I, and sigma, greater than 1 in our case, is the elasticity of substitution. And it is a constant, and that's why these preferences are called the constant elasticity of substitution preferences, or CES, which are by far the most used preferences in international trade. Why they are? Well, we'll see. They're going to be very, they're relatively flexible, but very tractable. They work well in the data, and they're also very intuitive. So if you manage to achieve these things with the preference structure or other functional forms, you're great. So let's see how this simple difference in the preferences is actually gonna yield a very different results in terms of predictions. The main difference between the Krugman 1980 model and the model that we saw previously is in the preferences used. Particularly in the Krugman 1980, we see the CES preferences. The utility of consumer is the summation from I equals 1 to capital N. We no longer have V of CI, but we have CI to the power of sigma minus 1 over sigma. Now, these preferences are particularly interesting, very tractable, yet flexible, and they have a property that the demand elasticity is constant. Now, to see this, you're gonna practice it extensively in the problem sets, but let's do it just for fun once. If we look at the first order condition of the consumer problem, what we have is sigma minus 1 over sigma, Ci minus 1 over sigma equals lambda pi. Now, if we want to derive the demand elasticity, we can proceed in several ways. Let's do it the same way we did for Krugman 79, taking the total derivative of that. What do we get? We get sigma minus 1 over sigma, which multiplies minus 1 over sigma C minus 1 over sigma, Ci, of course, minus 1 equals, of course, dc I equals lambda pi, lambda dpi. Okay, what now? Well, now we substitute in the demand, right? And what do we obtain? Well, we obtain a 1 minus sigma Ci minus 1. Actually, let me write it as dci over Ci equals, well, the lambda canceled out, dpi over pi. Okay, so our demand elasticity eta of Ci, which equals minus dci dpi pi over Ci equals, what is it equal to? If you play around with that formula above, you get sigma, which is constant. So eta prime of Ci equals 0. The demand elasticity does not depend on the output. It's a constant sigma. What is the implication of that? Well, the implication of that is that our PP condition, which we call is P over W equals beta, eta over eta minus 1, which we can also write as beta sigma over sigma minus 1, is constant, right? It's a horizontal curve. In contrast, our ZZ condition is the same. P over W equals beta plus alpha over LC. So if we represent this on a plane, what do we get? We get a declining function for the ZZ condition and a horizontal function for the PP condition. So what are the effects of trade? Well, effects of trade modeled again as an increase in L. Right? So if L increases, nothing happens to the PP condition, but the ZZ condition shifts downward. So what do we get? Get a new equilibrium where the consumption declines. Consumption for each variety declines relative to before, but the price remains constant. So this is C declines. This is the same as Krugman 79, the previous model. P over W, constant. This makes sense, right? I mean, if the markups are constant, there's no way of changing the price unless you change either the demand elasticity sigma or the marginal cost beta. Now, what happens to the total output? Well, to figure out what happens to total output, look again at the ZZ condition. We have is that P over W equals beta plus alpha over Y. Since P over W is constant, so is Y. Okay, so let us actually solve this out because we can find an expression for the output. Well, substituting PP in the ZZ condition, what we obtain is that sigma over sigma minus 1 beta equals beta plus alpha over y. So that you basically get is beta over sigma minus 1 equals alpha over y, and therefore y equals alpha over beta times sigma minus 1. So you can see output increases in the fixed cost, which kind of makes sense, right? The higher fixed cost, the higher the revenue firms must generate to get zero profits. And as a result, if the fixed costs are higher, the size of the firms will also be higher. And of course, total output declines instead in the variable cost and increases in sigma. We call the y equals L times C. Y is constant, C declines, L increases. And so basically, if L doubles, this result is saying that C decreases by to its half. Okay. So a percentage increase in L is matched by a percentage decline in C. So what about N? Well, NC increases. I guess that makes sense. Again, from the budget constraint. I call the NC equals 1 over P over W C. You know, the C declines, P over W is constant, so the number of varieties available for consumption increases, just like in the previous model. But what about the number of varieties produced in each country? NT and NT star. Well, recall that to determine those, we relied on the full employment condition. Full employment condition that said that the number of workers in each economy was equal to the NT firms were demanding labor was BY plus alpha. Okay. Well, Y is constant, L is constant, because we're looking at the workers in each economy. And so the number of varieties in each country is also constant. You can actually solve for this and find that NT equals L over beta times Y, which recall equals alpha over beta times sigma minus 1. Plus alpha. So the beta go away, and we have L over sigma alpha. So the number of varieties available for consumption increases in the size of the country. So bigger economies have more varieties, well, that we already established before, and declines in the fixed cost per variety, which also makes sense. Okay, so to summarize what happened here with trade, we have an increase in L. As in the previous model, C declines, so we're going to have less varieties for each, less consumption for each variety. However, the price does not change because we have constant markups, and markups do not change. Since the price does not change, neither does the total output, because the price equals the average cost. If the price is constant, the average cost is also constant, and the only way to keep the average cost constant is to keep the output constant. So these are the implication that if output is constant, a percentage increase in L is matched by a percentage decline in C. Then we also have that the number of varieties available for consumption increases, but the number of varieties produced in each country remains constant. So this is the case in which, say, Denmark has 5 varieties, start trading with Sweden, who also has 5 varieties. The two countries start trading. Nothing happens to markups, nothing happens to the increase in returns to scale. So the number of varieties in each country remains there. So there's still 5 varieties in Denmark and 5 varieties in Sweden. And consumers now have twice as many varieties available for consumption than before. So the crucial fact here is that although prices do not change, the number of varieties still increases. What are the main takeaways of the Krugman 1980 model? Well, countries, trade because they want to enjoy the varieties produced from abroad. You don't produce all the varieties that you want at home because of the fixed cost, as we saw before. But now there are no pro-competitive gains from trade. Prices do not change. We have more varieties available for consumption and no firm ties. So the only source of the gains from trade is the increase in the number of varieties available for consumption. To appreciate this result, you can also think of it in more general terms. Right? If we think about the old school international trade, we said that countries trade because they were different, but different in what? Well, different in some supply characteristics, right? Either technology or factor endowments. In these new trade theories, countries trade because they do have different supplies, right? Different supply features. They produce different varieties. But trade is really driven by the demand, right? Because consumers like to have more than one variety. They would like to consume the varieties from abroad. That's why countries trade. And you can see that going from Krugman 79 to Krugman 1980, what's really differing is the preferences. So it's the demand. So differences in demand generate differences in the prediction of the trade models. So that's it for today. Thank you for watching. I'll see you next time. Ciao.